Okay, welcome everyone. This is session 3.3. We have three really good looking presentations. Can't wait, and I don't want to waste any time. My name's Rob Cuthbert. I'm just chairing this session. I'm not going to get in the way though of our first set of presenters. That's Sandra Acker, Olli Helena Jyrki, and Michelle McGinn, sorry. They're going to talk about book editing as a scholarly practice. Can't wait. Sandra, I think you're starting.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Right, I am. Well, we're dividing the talk among the three of us. So from the beginning, Michelle, could you put the slides up, please? We're waiting for the slides. I can't start without the slide.
Of course, it worked perfectly when we did the test, and now it won't let me do that.
Yeah.
There we go. I think I got it now.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. So there's our title, Time from Now. Okay, Rob. Book editing is a scholarly practice. Over the past several years, the three of us, that's Sandra, Olli, Helena, and Michelle, have spent many hours preparing an edited volume on gender and research funding. This presentation is about that editing process, or what we call the backstory of the book story. This work contributes to what we call the scholarship of book editing, a field that barely exists. There's a little bit of information there about our book. It comprises 13 chapters reporting original research, and in one case, a literature review by multiple invited authors featuring the 4 countries of Canada, Finland, Sweden, and the UK, plus an introduction by those 3 beautiful editors that you see in the picture. We decided early on we wanted the book to feature within the SRHE Rutledge book series, Research into Higher Education. In this current paper, we consider some literature, describe the stages involved in editing the book, and then develop some themes that are not often discussed, but that characterized our editing experience. Why this paper? Publicity surprise. One reason we decided to delve into the backstory is that after several years of very hard work and umpteen emails, meetings, drafts, edits, close readings of copy edits, proofs, and index, author questionnaires, contracts, notes to the copy editor, biographies, blurbs, and so forth, burned out. Although Rutledge had its regular publicity apparatus, naively, we thought it would send books for review to journals in our field. We were shocked to find out they no longer did that. That's my question there in the first paragraph. And if we wanted a book review, we would need to identify the appropriate journals and contact them ourselves, sending them a form that they could send in to the publisher. We started the process making a list of 65 journals and their book review editors if they had them, and then we stalled. In trying to figure out why we felt so resistant, we began to think more deeply and critically about book editing itself. So we looked for literature on the subject of book editing. In fact, there's very little literature on this topic for this kind of book editing, and what there is tends to be advice rather than analysis. 2 contributions that stood out for us were Edwards, 2012, and Kumaran and Madison, 2018. Edwards moves through the stages of book editing, noting that as an activity, it is downgraded within academic merit systems, despite its many positive features. She suggests that editors should pay close attention to the time and effort involved compared to the rewards received. Kumaran and Madison take the reader through their own experience with editing, including some surprises as they negotiate with their publisher. These authors refer to book editing as a form of project management, contributing to efficiency, leading us to wonder whether some aspects of that approach might have been useful to us. So in the paper, we overview the editing process as we experienced it with early, middle, and late stages. Given this is a kind of surface view, but given time constraints, I won't read these details. More interesting is the next slide in the next approach, which is our backstory of the book story, going below the surface. And in the next sections, we elaborate on some identified issues that arise through the discussions and rereadings that we did, looking at our email communications, our agendas and minutes, publishers' documents, and other materials. Note that nearly all our communications were over email and Zoom due to pandemic restrictions and geographical distances. The slides list a number of emergent themes, and we decided to identify and talk about 3 of them, the ones in blue, pulling others in if we have the time. So Oili Helena will continue now with sensitivities. Over to you.
Thank you, Sandra. So sensitivities, the editing process typically encounters several sensitive issues, and our experience was no different. As we did not have an open call, we needed to decide who to invite to participate and who to leave uninvited. These delicate decisions were especially acute in the small Nordic context, where there are few academics working within higher education research, and they all tend to know each other quite well. The invitation may have career implications too, and we were paying attention to this also. On the one hand, it means an opportunity to publish internationally and become part of international networks. On the other hand, top journals have a higher status than edited books. Therefore, the time and effort put into book chapters can be a disadvantage in career building, especially for junior academics who may feel obliged to accept an invitation due to a sense of responsibility if a familiar senior colleague invites. In this way, invitations entail sensitive power-related considerations, and the same was true for deciding who to invite to write endorsements and who to suggest as peer reviewers of our proposal. Then communicating with contributors and commenting on their drafts was a sensitive task too, and we needed to try to formulate our feedback to be as supportive and constructive as possible. In some cases, there was also an element of mentoring involved, as we worked with authors to elaborate their texts. This kind of emotional side of commenting required extra work, but was necessary to keep all contributors motivated and on board. Sensitivity concerned also the content of the book. It was most visible in the expectation to include intersectionality in all chapters. None of the Finnish and Swedish contributors dealt with race and ethnicity, but looked at intersectionality from other perspectives, such as age, motherhood, discipline, and career stage. It became apparent that while work on gender and gender equality has a very strong tradition in the Nordic countries, race and ethnicity have only recently acquired more attention, and it involved also some disagreements among researchers. In this complex situation, we did not push contributors to go over their limits, but respected historical and cultural country differences. So next, more about country variations. So we had 4 countries, Canada, Finland, Sweden, and the UK. This focus added depth and interest, but also some difficulties. We made efforts to ask contributors to explain their relevant systems, but the authors did not necessarily know what might be different elsewhere. Even the same word, such as professor, can have a quite different meaning in different national contexts. At the same time, the same concept can be referred to with different words, terms. For instance, Canada uses equity, while European countries tend to use equality. In all 4 countries, it was often government and research agency documents and websites that gave us the most trouble in terms of accuracy, translations, acronyms, access, and consistency across chapters. We struggled not to get lost in the details of legislation, documents, and statistics. What made this task even more demanding was that the systems and the names and functions of different agencies seemed to be under constant transformation. Country variations concern also language. Our book is in English, which at the present is the global language of science. It has been claimed, for instance, by Iga-Maria Lehmann and Janne Tienari, that the hegemony of English produces inequalities and linguistic injustice in academia. It's not only a question of having to learn new language skills, but also new rhetorical conventions and ways of making arguments. This puts authors who are not native speakers at a disadvantage and requires more effort from them. In more concrete terms, non-native speakers of our authors needed to have their text language checked, which is a standard procedure in the Nordic countries. So now we move to Michelle.
Published advice recommends that would-be editors consider whether editing is right for them in terms of career stage, academic networks, communication skills, and self-discipline, plus energy and interest to see the project to completion. The literature rarely mentions the ways in which life factors could undermine these skills and predispositions and interfere with orderly plans for an edited work. But such considerations were focal for us as we worked through the project. There were multiple instances where life got in the way and things happened. Life happened. Yet we continued to work, rarely mentioning these interruptions to our publisher, though sometimes to each other. All 3 of us had migraines at times with varying degrees of seriousness. Collectively, we experienced COVID-19, cataract and dental surgery, and multiple concussions. 2 of us dealt with elder care issues. 1 moved house, another retired, 2 had trees crashing down in our back gardens, and we experienced work-life conflicts and work-work conflicts. 1 moved into a management position that required a great deal of time and responsibility, while all 3 had other research projects and some university service commitments. None of us had teaching roles at the time, which would have prompted further juggling, as did the unpredictable arrival of dissertation drafts submitted by doctoral students. An intended co-editor who was involved in the initial proposal writing and invitations to chapter authors moved out of an academic role and withdrew from the project, which affected task division and workflow. We also heard from some chapter authors who experienced similar work and life interruptions that affected their contributions to the book. Publisher representatives also juggled similar life events. Notably, our main contact at the publisher went on extended leave, and several replacements came and went until she returned. Friends and family must be in the mix and may play a major part in life, whether getting in the way or facilitating and encouraging the endpoint production. Emotional reactions of disappointment and frustration were sometimes associated with the various disruptions and detours as the editing project unfolded. Editors do not simply balance life with work, but negotiate an ever-present, ever-changing set of challenges. For this paper, we reviewed the literature on scholarly editing and compared it to our book editing experience. If it had occurred to us to seek out literature on editing in advance, we might have considered an approach closer to the project management style recommended by Edwards and Kumaran and Madison. We certainly would have benefited from enhanced file management and communication tools. Some other project management mainstays would not have worked smoothly due to the level of unpredictability in the process. For example, while we set dates for chapters to be submitted, not everyone met them. However, given the amount of time it took for the three of us to edit each one of those chapters, spreading out the submission dates turned out to be quite helpful. Now, important characteristic of our team, but rarely mentioned in the literature, was our geographic separation, with two of us in Canada, but in different countries, and one in Finland. The literature on project management in academic settings tends to involve situations where all members of a research group are in the same place. Most accounts of academic research project management mention planning, as much as can be anticipated, for risk. And one common risk often mentioned is a staff member leaving, as occurred in our team. There are various ways to plan for that eventuality, such as cross-training other team members and making sure all the data are on the main computer. Nihagen Pradelli is one of the few authors to explore the emotional labor involved when a work relationship that has also become a friendship breaks down. Some of our decisions turned out to be good ones. We picked the right publisher from the start. We began with the 3 countries, but then added Sweden as we were aware of some excellent authors from there. And we were slightly uneasy with the idea that Finland might alone be taken to represent the Nordic countries. Although a good decision for the right reasons, it did present some difficulties, given our collective lack of insider knowledge of the country. Ideally, we would have included a co-editor with Swedish experience. Our team also lacked an early career researcher once our original colleague left. Finally, do we have advice for others? Would we go through this editing process again? For the pleasure of working together and building relationships with chapter authors and the intellectual stimulation, we would have to say yes. It would have helped to know what was ahead and to find a way to be less anxious about the minutiae of style and format and to approach the publicity expectations in better spirit. And it's likely that we did not fully meet Edward's criterion of reward justifying time investment. But then how are we really to judge? We resist merely paying attention to those standardized metrics. Overall, we remain proud of the accomplishment. And at that point, I will conclude the conversation and open up the conversation. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, great timing. Lovely. And we're open for questions and chat. There are no questions yet appearing in the chat, but I can see a number of experienced editors among the group, and if they're like me, we've identified with everything you've said. Although we didn't, I certainly haven't had trees falling down in my back garden, so that's one good thing. A hand up from someone, Arokia Mary.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Arokia, and thank you for the fascinating presentation. I'm an early career researcher, not yet edited any books, so this is quite a learning experience for me. I had certain learning questions for me, regarding how were the 4 countries selected? Was it something which was based on the editors, or how was that decision of 4 countries, Canada, Finland, UK, and Sweden decided, if you could throw some light on it? Thank you.
Can I answer it? Okay, well, some of us were in Canada. Well, once we decided to work together, 2 of us were in Canada and 1 of us was in Finland. 1 of us had lived in the UK for some time, so had a number of connections there. So already it seemed that those countries would make interesting contrasts. And as Michelle said, we decided at a later point to add Sweden for the reasons that she gave. In general, we wanted countries that were not too extremely different, because we thought we could find some commonalities as well as some differences. We did not want to produce a book with 25 different countries. There are a lot of those in the higher education field, like when they've done surveys across the world, and then they produce a book with chapters from each country. We felt those kinds of books already had appeared, and they were harder to make your way through. People would maybe say, okay, I'm interested in Germany. So I'll read the chapter on Germany. We hoped with our smaller focus, people would say, okay, let's read all of those chapters and see what we can compare, see what's interesting about them, and not, just put the book aside after you read one chapter. So, you could have made other choices. These were partly convenience and partly because we knew authors that were very good in each of those countries as well. It's also a topic that not a lot of people have written about, pulling together research funding and gender too. So that focused our choices as well. As Oily Helena said, though, the choices of authors are also sensitive choices too.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Yeah, and nice development from that theme. Diana has a question saying, did you come up with any new conceptual frames on the topic? Did the chapters and their combined content shift any thinking in relation to the book's topic, especially in the introduction?
Oh, somebody else like to answer that. Michelle or Helena?
Maybe I'll say a few things, and if
Yeah.
either of you want to jump in. With an edited collection, I would say there are interesting contributions from each individual piece. And so there are, some different ways of thinking about and framing each of the authors or collections of authors made some advance in their individual chapter. Overall, thinking about what did we learn about this? A key point I would say is that so little has been written about the research funding piece. So we know a fair bit about gender and academic careers, and we know some about research funding and how that imperative has shifted what the expectations are and really shifted the kind of working conditions for academics. But to pull those two things together, that was novel in terms of the book. And at that larger level, thinking about what did we learn from this process, I think the thing that stands out most for me is how quickly the funding expectations and requirements change, and the need to be really flexible in responding to what's happening in the context, to still be able to move forward with one's research program, to advance understandings without, getting mired in, oh, they've now changed the name of the funder and the funding program and where that work fits. So really complexities there. I don't know what else we'd say in terms of broader conceptual frames for the topic.
I think we could add that there are subtle differences among countries. You can see it even in countries that are very similar in other ways. And some of those differences do interrelate with factors like gender. One of our chapters picked up the discourses that attach themselves to a lot of the calls for funding, and they use words like moonshots and I can't remember some of the others, but they're words, rockets, that sound like great big phallic discoveries that are not sort of directed towards people that might not feel like that kind of language is theirs, including many women. So there are things like that come out when you start to delve into the discourses that surround calls for funding and types of funding and rules around funding. Like the general push for huge cross-national studies, research projects, like why do they have to be cross-national and require travel that is not necessarily easy for people in certain parts of their lives to conduct. So there are things like that go across individual countries that come out in these frameworks. But as Michelle said, it's difficult to pull from all of the different circumstances. Good question.
Yeah, that was the easy question. The next one is a bit harder. Leah says, how challenging was it to arrive at a shared understanding of what counts as research? Michelle, you're a VP for research.
Yeah.
Well, I think the chapter authors have approached that in various ways, right? So I think some of the gendered perspectives that they brought forward was around, does the work count as research, or do the people count as researchers? So I think there are some gendered nuances that come up with that, that come to play in understanding what counts as research. In my role as VP Research, I certainly talk about all of the things that constitute research, but that's not necessarily the way the participants whose stories were being presented in the various chapters, many of them were based on qualitative research analyses of researchers' experiences. And so that feeling of having their work acknowledged and validated, whether that's by securing the funds or just having it recognized. We talk about, some chapters that look at things like development of a new field, or, what's in vogue in terms of where the funding is or where the support from the institution comes, that shifts. And there are some gendered elements to those transitions as well. So, various ways of thinking about what constitutes research. And going back to the part of the presentation here that Oili Helena made, which was around the language and what that looks like when a funder uses particular language, or a particular national context talks about what's the research that's valued at present, that there were lots of shifts over time with that as well.
There were interesting cases where somebody was a researcher. What is a researcher is different from one place to another, how the system works. And there were people in one or two categories who had left, for example, to be on maternity leave, that then couldn't get back because their project had moved on. Things that may never have happened in another setup. Oili Helena, you want to comment?
Just one point. It was, I think, interesting that you don't do research if you don't get funding. So that's I think that before it was possible to do your own research without any extra funding, but now research is defined as something that that has external funding, and then you are doing research projects. So it's that was the understanding in our chapters, I think.
It's more ambiguous in Canada, I would say. You can still be doing research without funding, but you might not get the same kind of credit for it.
And Alina's put a nice sort of helpful pointer in there to the differences between HE and other kinds of project management. But Celia's asked the question that every book editor wants an answer to. Was there a point at which you had to abandon an author or a chapter, and did you replace them or not? I can really identify with that one.
What was the question? Did you
abandon
an author or a chapter?
The chapter is in the chat, Sandra, that you can read it there, but maybe I'll start and you can add.
Okay.
Certainly we started off with invitations. Some of our invitations were declined, but others, we had a few chapters proposals that came in that didn't fit that mix between gender and research funding, that it didn't look like they were headed in the right direction. So early on then at the proposal stage, we could move away from those particular chapters. So there was that point. And then I will say later on in the process, there was another point where we didn't abandon, but we're questioning whether one of the chapters would appear. We knew that one of the collections of authors who had agreed to submit were facing some other of those work and life interferences that we weren't convinced that the chapter was going to show up in time. So we ended up approaching somebody else as a replacement, but we didn't abandon that first one. We said, well, let's see what happens, because we really wanted to have that chapter as well. But at the same time, we sort of hedged our bets by inviting someone else in, which then we ended up with both chapters showing up and decided that we would include both of them. What that did was it shifted a bit, because we had initially planned that we would have an even number of chapters from each of the countries. So based on who accepted or didn't accept, that shifted that balance. And then when we ended up with an extra chapter from one space, we went, okay, that's okay. It's fine. It still makes a nice collection. And we have the 4 countries represented.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the first ones that I think there were 3 that had come in as first drafts that we decided didn't quite fit for one reason or another. In all of those cases, as I remember, we wrote quite carefully and sensitively about how they might change them to fit better. But in all of those cases, those changes would have required a ton of work. So the people agreed with us that they didn't want to do that much work. So hopefully they could save face and not just feel that they were being totally rejected.
Yeah.
And we didn't get a sense that they felt bad, but who knows? You know, it's hard to know. There were also some people that did not take up our invitations. They had too much work, or they had some leave coming up or something else, or a few people never even answered. So when Helena talks about the sensitivities, there could be people thinking, oh, how come they didn't ask X, you know, the foremost authority in the field? But maybe we did ask X and they said no because they were too busy. Who knows? No, nobody will know that because it isn't in the footnotes.
Yeah. Now, I just want to squeeze one last comment in before we move on to the next presentation. It's Kate Critherstonas.
Hello, hi, lovely to see Sandra and Michelle.
Hi there.
Hi, and Helena, I'm sorry I didn't meet you at the last conference, but I am one of the authors of this marvelous edited collection, and I just wanted to comment on the ethics of care that was displayed by this group of editors, and I don't know if you've taken it up or will take it up in the paper or whatever you're going to do with this piece of work, but certainly, and you have mentioned the thoughtfulness and sensitivity with which you responded to people, but certainly as an author, I felt very much kind of guided through the process and shielded from all the stuff that you've actually, you mentioned in terms of engagements with the publisher. We did get little hints of that, but in no way did we got any sense of those, taking those on. So I think that's a really important area of this work. And I think it's why a lot of people, myself included, prefer to write chapters in edited collections rather than journal papers, because of that engagement that you get, both academic and individual, with the editors usually. Or maybe I was just really lucky, I don't know. Anyway, it's really good to see you.
Thanks, Kate. And I'm going to have to finish it there. Sorry. Lovely presentation. Thanks to all of you. We'll no doubt we'll possibly pick these up later on. Diana, I can see your hands up, but I'm going to have to move on, I'm afraid, because otherwise we're going to eat into other people's time. So I'm going to move on to Kwame and invite him to talk about the art of working together.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll just do a quick sound check. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Is my volume okay?
Yep. Sure thing,
Perfect.
we can hear you. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. So, hello, everyone. My name is Kwame Diko, and I'm here to present the results from my master's thesis titled The Art of Working Together, a phenomenological study of interdepartmental collaboration within Ontario universities. Moving on. So, we begin all our presentations with a land acknowledgement of the university. So I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Whenever we do a land acknowledgement, it's important to reflect on what this really means to us. And growing up within cooperative housing in downtown Toronto, I was surrounded by cement and not a lot of greenery. I couldn't imagine what a university campus was like. And now that I'm able and I have the opportunity to spend some time on the tri-campus University of Toronto landscape, I have a true appreciation for the land in which I commence and progress my studies and my professional practice. So mapping our time together, I value brevity and conciseness. So this will be our agenda for our brief time together. I'll cover the context, methods, findings, conclusions, and finally the discussion for my study. So Canadian universities are facilitating change and responding to pressures to solve increasingly complex problems. Problems and pressures that they subsequently create arise from diverse areas, including political, financial, geographical, and social contexts, making them highly complex and difficult to solve and resolve. Institutional strategies continue to develop and evolve in complexity in hopes of responding to pressures and solving problems. Strategy, for the purpose of my research, is the process of initiating adequate responses to pressures and solving problems. Um, to support the operationalization of strategy, universities have developed professional staff roles and upgraded responsibilities to collaborate across institutional boundaries. However, collaborating effectively requires more than just new roles and enhanced responsibilities. Universities are now adjusting organizational structures from siloed roles to more collaborative models where professional staff now have increased responsibility and autonomy to work together across boundaries to support these institutional strategies. In addition to strategies that encourage collaboration, governance and senior managers at the operational levels within units or departments encourage these updates to roles of professional staffs to create highly collaborative workforces. While collaboration within universities is crucial for tackling complex problems, several obstacles restrain this practice. First, siloed departmental structures and competing priorities hindered interdisciplinary collaboration. Second, inadequate communication and coordination leads to inefficiencies with collaboration. And third, limited resources and cultural differences among departments within institutions may impede collaborative efforts. Collaboration is challenging because universities need it, but it's not a given, as many variables may derail it in practice. There is no standard method to collaborate, as the activity itself involves negotiation, conflict, and methods of communication that all operate on a dynamic scale. My study built upon previous research to understand collaboration within universities with a particular focus on professional staff experiences within Ontario institutions. I answered the following question: how do Ontario University professional staff who engage in collaborative work experience and make sense of collaboration? Summarize, I want to explore how institutions get different people to work together successfully. My aim is to provide a rich and contextually grounded exploration of collaboration in higher education, bringing valuable insights to the academic community, professional staff, senior admin, and policymakers. My positioning is situated at the intersection of my personal, academic, and professional experiences. I have a desire to understand people working together, compounded by an insatiable feeling of we're missing something here when we discuss professional collaboration. My lens for exploring collaboration is derived from my philosophical worldview of constructivism with a focus on phenomenon surrounding subjective experience. My study investigated experiences of professional staff and student engagement, community engagement, and equity and diversity and inclusion roles within Ontario universities that engaged in higher amounts of interdepartmental collaboration. I employed a qualitative research design using case study methodology as my primary research approach. I conducted a multiple case study of 10 appointed Ontario University professional staff in the mentioned roles. Titles like coordinators, administrators, managers, leads, or even special project officers were included in the study. For this study, a case was defined as a professional staff member in one of the above-mentioned roles that was employed for at least 1 year and who would be willing to speak confidentiality about their perspectives on a recent professional collaboration that involved other departments or units that was guided by strategic mandate. Purposeful sampling was used within the study. Professionals were first identified by their departments being mentioned in strategic frameworks and plans relevant to institutional changes, encompassing community or student engagement and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Data analysis followed Hubbard et al.'s and Mitrinder's prescriptions for case study research. My research focused on the experience and sense making, so analysis was inductive and deductive. Inductive and deductive techniques were used to identify themes between cases and existing theories or new and emergent explanations. My coding approach is best described by Moser 2019, where processes enabled collected data to be assembled, categorized, and thematically sorted, providing an organized platform for constructing meaning. Transcripts were analyzed using an evolving coding scheme in Vivo 2014. Findings from my research indicate that interdepartmental collaboration amongst professional staff within universities is dynamic, complex, and necessary to accomplish institutional goals. I categorize my findings into 3 main themes with associated subthemes. The first theme is that professional staff experience interdepartmental collaboration as a subset of co-constructed activities, which connects experiences of collaboration to how institutions sort of believe it occurs. The second theme is non-financial buy-in from executive leadership is limited, but influential in interdepartmental collaboration amongst professional staff. This sort of theme explored how professional staff experience executive support for interdepartmental collaboration without funds or specific budget allocations. The third theme is professional staff who can continuously decode what they do and explores how professional staff interpret and make sense of their roles, objectives, and responsibilities. Participants advise that activities that facilitate collaboration also maintain the ability to hinder it, pointing towards experiences of collaboration as fluid and co-constructive activities. Of the activities, there were 3 that were reoccurring in all participants. One was the activity of determining success and what that meant, facilitating engagement, and also establishing relationships. Our first sub-theme was that multimodal support from the institution assists with interdepartmental collaboration. Participants indicated that multimodal institutional support is described as sort of help through various or assorted approaches, addressing social, emotional, cultural, and practical needs embedded within interdepartmental collaboration. Over half of the participants in the study mentioned multimodal support from the institution, stating that this took form through infrastructure, cultural support from universities. Institutional strategy and being mentioned in institutional strategic mandates and funding were examples of this. And organizational culture was also mentioned, describing the need for time and space for the construction of relationships between departments or units. Our second subtheme was that power imbalance assists with interdepartmental collaboration. Participants defined power as the individual ability to steer and construct connections, decisions, resources, participation, and time within the collaboration. Empowering partners to manage these responsibilities or these activities was denoted as beneficial for facilitating collaboration. Stagnation restrains interdepartmental collaboration. Stagnation as a restraint to collaboration was an emergent theme in participant responses, as individuals reported experiencing distraction, difficulty operating with oversight, and navigating departmental subcultures. These activities prevented progress as collaborations were not able to move forward. Isolation restrains interdepartmental collaboration. Participants reported that isolation restrained collaboration, creating challenges that slowed the initiation or sustaining of shared work amongst professional staff. They described situations where teammates felt alone, disengaged, not feeling heard, and validated, which lead to restraint taking hold, ultimately hindering the ability to sustain collaboration. An emergent finding was the informal terms of interdepartmental collaboration. There was a notable lack of information discussing the terms of collaboration, suggesting the presence of unwritten norms or ad hoc practices to fill the gap left by the absence of formal agreements. Collaboration as an informal process was an emergent finding within a limited but highly insightful amount of data that discussed formal agreements. Formal partnership agreements were only mentioned by one participant, representing one of 7 institutions that participated in the study. They did not mention when they decided to use or not use partnership agreements, which supports the theme that there's a gap in understanding like what these informal processes are. Another interesting finding was that non-financial buy-in from executive leadership is limited but influential during interdepartmental collaboration amongst professional staff. Participants described non-financial buy-in from executive leadership as support for interdepartmental collaboration amongst professional staff without allocated funds or budgets. They provided examples such as examples of the support, such as the widening of communication channels, endorsement during high-profile interactions or meetings, and consult for large decisions that progress the collaboration, and briefly described how the absence of these activities could hinder collaboration and may cause it to break down. Professional staff who engage in interdepartmental collaboration continuously evaluate their roles and responsibilities. Participants shared that institutional strategies and personal interpretations of what their tasks with day-to-day continuously shape their perceptions of roles and responsibilities. During the study, participants were asked to reflect on their journey to their current roles alongside their current role and responsibilities. There was a notable pause in most of the responses, followed by the use of the terms complex, messy, tricky during conceptions. And at one point or multiple points, participants actually asked me what they think I did based off what they said so far. Dynamics underscored most of their responses, and it maintained significance in how they collectively understand and navigate their roles and responsibilities. Another emergent finding was that professional staff within EDI roles perceived their objectives as system spanning, impactful, and aligned to institutional strategy. Participants were asked to describe the key objectives they were responsible for, and they aligned their work to institutional strategy spanning multiple departments. Responses from these participants who worked with an EDI had three similarities. All responses reference being directly impacted, or they have the ability to impact a broad spectrum of individuals within their universities. They all mentioned working outside of their departments to accomplish objectives, and half of the participants referenced strategy being mentioned in strategy or strategic mandates, as this grounded their work in times of flux or confusion. So in conclusion, how do Ontario University professional staff who engage in collaborative work experience and make sense of collaboration? Professional staff experience interdepartmental collaboration as a subset of co-constructed activities. They make sense of interdepartmental collaboration by combining perspectives of executive leadership, institutional strategy, and their own conceptions. Participants, building on that, they conceive their roles, responsibilities, and objectives by embracing institutional goals, organizational subcultures, and their own personal reflections about what they do, accepting the dynamic nature of all involved. They navigate organizational structures and cultures to accomplish objectives, often boundary spanning to work within other units or departments. They also reported that this type of collaboration was critical to accomplishing goals outlined in their institutional strategies. In terms of implications, and this aligns with Church's work on third space professional. It also aligns with Williams' concept of boundary spanning in organizational contexts. Implications for policy and practice. I hope this work will grow to be a resource for university leaders as they design professional roles, and this will encourage institutions to look closely at what professional staff do to provide resources and opportunities to support their goals. In terms of limitations, the sample size and breadth were limitations of the study, as I only focused on community or student engagement roles and equity, diversity, and inclusion roles. Future research will hopefully explore formal and informal terms of collaboration with the inclusion of a larger and more representative sample of professional staff. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank Professor Levine and the HELO team for allowing me to do this research within their lab for my thesis. And also, finally, thank you to you all for listening to my master's thesis presentation about the work that I've done. And finally, a slide on my references. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kwame. Brilliant time management. Well done. And we have Celia Whitchurch here, and I'm sure she'll want to comment in a minute. And we also have your supervisor, Eric Levine, here. So we're well stocked with expertise here. This is great. But the question is, did you satisfy your insatiable worry that you were missing something?
No, so I do hope to progress and further my studies with Professor Levine. It's been a dream to continue to fulfill this insatiable feeling of we're missing something here. So hopefully I get to continue with the team.
Right, let's open it out for questions if anybody wants to come through. Yeah, Sandy.
I have a question, but I can't find the audio. Let's see, audio. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, it's on. Okay, thanks. Okay. When I think of collaboration between departments, when on the faculty level, I hardly can find any. It's interesting to think about it in terms of professional staff, because I don't know that much about what goes on at that level. Are you thinking of people who have the same job collaborating, like the person who might be, like you said, the EDI person collaborating with an EDI person in another department, or across jobs, like EDI collaborating with some other kind of administrator? That's part of the question. And the second part is, what do they actually do when they collaborate? Are they planning a party? Are they planning a seminar? Are they doing something else? I wasn't clear on either of those because I can't remember things that would fit into this kind of collaboration. Maybe because I'm retired and I don't see it going on now. So if you could give a few examples, that might help me visualize the interactions you're talking about.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'll pull from some of the information that the folks in EDI roles mentioned when it comes to collaborating. So they did not mention collaborating with other sort of EDI practitioners within institutions, really what they mentioned was enacting everything or anything outlined in strategic mandates of institutions. So one of the biggest things over the past couple of years was implementing sort of anti-colonial and anti-racist sort of practices and pedagogies within multiple areas within an institution, sort of embedding EDI practices within multiple areas of the institution. So they would work with different departments. So whether it be a faculty member or an associated department in the team there, but they also worked with maybe data teams to launch sort of studies about what the demographics of an institution would be. So the work really took multiple forms, and there was no standard kind of like, this is exactly what they do. It was kind of like when they spoke about their roles, they didn't say this, but a lot of the things that they used or a lot of the skills they employed were those found in project managers. So to be able to go into a certain area, accomplish something, or work with the team through a set of protocols, accomplish something, and then go somewhere else and do something totally different, but revolved around sort of the larger framework that is equity, diversity, inclusion, or practice that is EDI. Now, for community and student engagement roles, this was an interesting one because the participants mentioned the work that they were doing was to sort of open the university up a little. So embracing that institutions are only as strong as communities to which they serve. So this included, working on maybe alternative admission pathways, mature student pathways, bridging pathways, but also looked at how to engage local community engage local community to align with any of the strategies that universities talked about or requested. So there was no simple way or no simple job or no like aligned job. They kind of worked on everything, which was I thought was very hard for them, but yes.
Helpful, thank you.
Good, thanks. Now we have a question from Celia, who may or may not disappear in a minute to collect her groceries, but she said, what about barriers collaboration? How would you define the third space they were working in? And she said, please excuse me if I have to go.
Thank you. And thank you for all your work. I very much enjoyed reading almost every publication, Professor Whitchurch. It was awesome. So how were there any barriers to collaboration? So I think that the groups, or another interesting finding, which I didn't write about, was everyone was actually quite optimistic about their work. They didn't necessarily discuss barriers, but only sort of mention restraints or things that made it hard. And I would love to dive into like why. They didn't necessarily say like, and I used those as sort of barriers because they would maybe stop it from starting or stop it from collaboration from continuing. So definitely something for me to look into, why they didn't use the term barriers or didn't like amply define it and mention it as restraints. And in terms of the third space that they were working in, I would define it as like constantly being in flux because these staff, it was interesting because when they talked about the work that they did not denote that, this is my home role, I'm in this office, and primarily the work that I do is run within this office. It's almost like they were travelers. They would say, this is what I do, but I do this with another department, and this with another department, and this with another department. So when I asked them to define like, their to conceive what they actually do on a day-to-day basis or how would they describe their role, they almost always described it as like being in motion, being in flux, snowballing from one place to another. And I thought that was very interesting. And when I read your papers about sort of professionals constantly defining the work that they do as one of the characteristic of third space professionals, that was apparent in all of their responses, I would say. So constantly being in movement and in flux, but yet accomplishing really awesome things for the institution is how I would define third space.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm not even sure.
Yes, you're fine, Celia.
No, I mean, it's really interesting that because usually people complain about barriers to what they're doing. So OISE is obviously a very enlightened place. I've just been in Germany speaking alongside Glenn Jones. So yeah, so very interesting. And I love the idea of travellers. I haven't thought of that before. And snowballing. That's great. You should write a paper on that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor.
That's in the literature, yeah.
Next year
Thank
we'll
you.
see you here on that then, Kwame. Now I've got two people lined up. Michelle first, and then Dieter wants to come in after that. Michelle.
Thank you, Kwame. This is interesting. I'd like to follow up on just thinking about the collaboration, and you characterize sort of two different groups of who you were talking to. So the EDI professionals and the student engagement professionals. I wondered if there were differences across those groups. When I think about EDI and the, EDI doesn't work if it's just the job of one person or one office. Whereas student engagement, maybe, the engagement can happen if it's prompted from one space, whereas we all have to be in if it's EDI for EDI to actually happen. So any differences across those two groups in terms of the collaboration or what they were talking about?
Yes. So when it came to, I think one of the sub-themes I mentioned was isolation. That wasn't necessarily a difference in itself, but the way in which they described isolation, or like what it meant for the collaboration, was pretty interesting. So exactly what you said was reported by everyone who worked with an EDI. They said this work will not get done if it's isolated. And they kept mentioning how there's no point in even like approaching the work if it's not collaborative in nature, right from conception all the way through to completion. For student and community engagement, I had to practice reflexivity because I thought like the same thing that you thought. I thought like, oh, like you could probably run a student engagement office and do some awesome work just with that office. But they actually described isolation in a sort of similar but different way, but they stated that a couple of folks stated that due to the sort of changing demographics and needs of students, isolation won't work for them either, because students do want more of a fulsome and wholesome experience. So a couple of examples were mentioned, such as like events within an institution. It wouldn't work if there was no representation from sort of faculty or other departments. In terms of other differences, I haven't explored that yet, but that was sort of one where I kind of expected like, oh, one of these folks or these groups of individuals can do the work, one cannot, but they both kind of said they can't, but for different reasons. So I know that sort of only half answers the question, but the other half of the answers, I do need to explore that more. Thank you.
Yeah, more research is needed. We all have to agree with that. Dieter had a question on the chat saying you mentioned power imbalance facilitated cross-departmental collaboration. Could you expand on that and comment on the need for power symmetry within the hierarchy?
Absolutely. So I think I mentioned a little while ago of the ways in which sort of project management skills kind of became apparent in what the professional staff I interviewed were saying. Usually within those sort of defined protocols or processes, everyone has a role, or everyone has sort of a role associated with a specific job. And don't you dare step out of line, because you need to accomplish what you need to do, or what you've been told to do, if you will. This didn't really work as reported by the professional staff that I interviewed. When I mentioned power imbalance, I think I defined it in the slide as the ability to sort of steer how interdepartmental collaboration works, and to sort of exchange sort of the power to decide when to start, when to stop, and to define roles within a specific collaboration. That's sort of what I meant by the asymmetry. All participants mentioned that if they came in with very rigid rules surrounded power, roles, and responsibilities, the collaboration wouldn't necessarily work, or not necessarily they wouldn't work. They reported that in order to work internally and with other departments, you needed to be able to sort of give up power, to let departments steer the collaboration, and to know when to exchange, when to take a back seat or a front seat in leading sort of the work that needs to be done. Thank you.
All good, thank you. And I think we now need to move on to our third presentation. Kwame, that was great. Thank you very much. And so we can move to Nora Timmerman in Northern Arizona, and she is going to talk about crossing the line or not.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Let's see. Oops. You can probably see the whole presenter view now, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
we can
that's
see everything
correct.
remaining,
Okay, I
including.
don't want
Yeah, that's it.
that.
You got it. Yeah, that's it.
There it is.
Yep.
Okay. Great. Okay, so thank you for that introduction. I'm grateful to be on this panel with all of you. Thank you for being here. My name is Nora Timmerman, and I'm coming from you from the base of Sacred Peaks, very tall mountains in northern Arizona called Dokosleet, which are sacred to more than 13 different indigenous nations. Otherwise often known as Flagstaff, Arizona, and Northern Arizona University. And I'm going to be talking about, my presentation is pretty squarely focused on the theme for this year's conference on activism in higher education. And specifically, I've done a lot of research and I'm very interested in faculty involvement in activism. So the phrase crossing the line is something that generally has a pretty negative implication. It often implies trespass, boundary crossing, and some kind of violation. And the authors of the 2024 SRHE conference call for papers point out the challenges that universities face to navigate the, quote, line between social critique, dissent, and insubordination. And so in this paper, I'm deconstructing the notion of the line in academic activism with a specific focus on the lines of what we consider, quote unquote, appropriate activism that are created by and for faculty activists. I'm going to first explain the question that I'm hoping to answer today and the purpose behind why I'm asking it. I share the data sources that I'm using for the inquiry, and then to answer it, I break the discussion down into three components. First, I'm going to explain what lines are made for faculty activists. Second, how those lines are reinforced. And finally, why do faculty choose to cross those lines despite the risks and sometimes negative implications? What I wanted to know and learn about with this paper was what kinds of lines, institutional lines of acceptable activism are created for faculty activists, how they're reinforced, and why and when do faculty cross them. And I want to clarify from the beginning about what kinds of institutional lines I'm referring to with this question. I'm focused on the institutional rules, the limits or the boundaries that guide faculty activist conduct in particular. So what are the norms, the expectations, and the policies that tell faculty when and how it's acceptable to be, quote unquote, political and or politically expressive? I mention this because I want to be clear that I'm not referring to institutional lines regarding interpersonal behavior and boundaries. So there's, lines between what kind of hallway comment is considered friendly and what kind of comment is considered harassment. So while betrayal, dishonesty, and assault are also examples of crossing a line, this paper is focused instead on institutional, not interpersonal line crossings. I find it meaningful to ask this question because it can help faculty activists better understand the constraints that they face. So for example, in May of this year, when students at my university were planning an encampment, a group of supportive faculty gathered and asked themselves, well, what are we allowed to do? What isn't allowed? And what are the risks? In part, the purpose of my paper is to elucidate upon some of the commonly established lines of what's acceptable behavior, but a second purpose is to critically interrogate the idea of the line when we're talking about faculty activism. I want to problematize the notion that the line is indisputable and clear, that it cannot be broken with intention, and that it indicates a kind of value binary, or that, crossing the line is bad, not crossing it is good. Data from this paper comes from 4 different sources, well, really 3. First, I analyzed 10 oral history interviews with faculty activists from 4 United States-based post-secondary institutions, each of which participated in sustained and collaborative forms and disruptive forms of campus activism that were aligned with a social movement in the 20th century. 5 of those interviews are with faculty from the University of Michigan who participate in anti-Vietnam War activism, 3 from San Francisco State University, who went on strike for 5 months for racial liberation, 1 from the University of Hawaii, who coordinated a blockade for an indigenous-led anti-eviction movement, and 1 from faculty at Columbia, who participated in anti-apartheid sit-ins. I also draw from archival materials from those same different cases, so newspapers, photographs, meeting minutes, pamphlets, etc. I've done extensive literature reviews of faculty activism. And finally, I also bring in autoethnographic notes from my own work as a faculty advisor for my campus's movement for fossil fuel divestment, and also my participation and other faculty's participation at my university's pro-Palestinian encampment movement. So, what kinds of institutional lines are created for faculty activists? Some institutional lines are written in policy or state law. So, for example, most public post-secondary institutions have policies that dictate how faculty may exercise their personal right to protest as citizens, but not as representatives of the institution. And as protesters on my campus learned, the state also reserves the right to impose the time, place, and manner restrictions on when, where, and how people can exercise their right to free speech. So, for example, this is in my state of Arizona. Arizona State Law 15/1866 dictates that students and faculty members have the freedom to discuss any problem that presents itself, as the First Amendment allows, and within the limits of reasonable viewpoint and content-neutral restrictions on time, place, and manner of expression that are consistent with this article and that are necessary to achieve a compelling institutional interest if those restrictions are clear, are published, and provide ample alternative means of expression. So where do those policies come from? How is it that in the United States, we have a constitutional right to protest and free expression, but state and institutional policies can bound that right such that it is only allowed at certain times, in certain places, and in certain manners? Well, I argue that many of the lines on where people draw what kind of time, place, and manner is allowed, those are drawn on acceptable on the lines of interdependence and refusal. So essentially, behavior that allows the institution to function is permissible and does not cross the line, and behavior that clogs the institution by disrupting its functioning is unacceptable and does cross the line. I want to give an example. There's a line between a faculty mentor for a student club that writes a letter for divestment. Yes, I am drawing from my personal experience on this. And being a faculty member who sets up a tent on the lawn and is not willing to leave until the divestment demand is met. The mentor, the faculty mentor, who's guiding students on how to write or collect signatures on and deliver a letter, they're not disrupting the functioning of the university. At no point in the writing, signature gathering, or delivering of the letter is the faculty member refusing to complete any of their otherwise required job duties. On the other hand, the faculty mentor who sets up a tent and refuses to leave a common space, if joined by enough others, they're disrupting the functioning of the university. They do this in 2 ways. First, by placing their body in a space that draws attention and may literally clog transportation routes. And secondly, by effectively striking and removing a certain kind of labor from the functioning of the university. The line between acceptable and unacceptable faculty process is thus constituted by refusal to do what others depend on you for. It's a line that draws its power from interdependence. The institution depends on its employees for its functioning, and if enough of those employees withdraw their cooperation, the institution cannot function. Second, how are the institutional lines of faculty activism, acceptable faculty activism, enforced or reinforced? The lines between acceptable and unacceptable activism, they're enforced through a range of overt and perceived forces. Law enforcement officers forcefully removed 21 students and 3 community members from my university in May 2024 and charged them with trespassing. If faculty had been in the encampment with them, they would also have been forcefully removed. In addition to the use of overt force, cultural norms of institutional loyalty are strong amongst educators. As we just heard in the plenary session, Kathleen Lynch spoke about the role of fear and how we police ourselves through our own fear and through our subscription to managerialism. These act as a kind of hegemony by which we control ourselves and reinforce an acceptability politics that pleases the ruling class. Adding on to this historical moment of widespread precarity in higher education, the lack of job security is wielded both from the inside and outside of faculty communities to instill fear of loss for any activist conduct that falls outside what might be acceptable expression. One University of Michigan faculty member I interviewed explained a shift in faculty culture as one of the reasons that faculty stay within the lines of what's expected to them. They said, "How would you form a counterculture these days with faculty? They aren't feeling countercultural. They're not interested in counterculture, but the students are." Faculty tend not to cross the line because they don't know how, they don't know that they can, and in many ways the line itself says, no, you can't. So they actually can't cross the line legitimately. Crossing the line is institutionally illegitimate. It's not allowed. Crossing the line is by definition rule breaking, but it is the very act of rule breaking that can be an act of political leveraging if you have enough people and if you have enough organization and sustenance, timing, and momentum. Employees sense this line and they stay within it because there are real risks to clogging the machine, particularly if they are a singular or part of a small group of cloggers. So, given all of those risks, why do faculty activists cross lines? The intensity with which the line of acceptable activism is managed, it's proportional to the power held within its breaking. It's heavily policed both figuratively and literally because the university cannot function when enough employees or students cross the line. The ability to shut down the university gives groups of faculty power over those who need the institution to function, which is precisely why groups do cross the line. What I mean to say here is that activists banding together to cross the line can be an act of power. In my research, it's clear that faculty cross the line because they feel the university needs to act. Universities are often small cities unto themselves, wielding political and material power. To make changes within them is to have an impact on society. And oftentimes faculty will do a lot of work to try and make a change peacefully and be unsuccessful. Oftentimes staying within the lines of what is acceptable does not result in any kind of meaningful change. Conditions become unbearable within the university and or within student protest, and faculty members will often intervene. I wrote the quote here from Frederick Douglass: "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will." That's a lot of the reason why faculty members move to act, and their acting must cross lines because the university doesn't feel the pressure without it. So thus crossing the line, it's not simply just a risky move, or it's not an act of subordination or something that's culturally inappropriate. It can often be a strategic political action. In conclusion, I just have this is just kind of a summary of the points I've gone over. So interdependence is what can create those lines of activism in the first place, that the state, the university depends on us for certain functioning of the university, and it's whether that functioning is possible or not that constitutes the line. Oftentimes it is overt coercion that can enforce those lines, but it also often comes from within. Our internalized norms and fear can prevent faculty activism. And finally, crossing the line by refusing to cooperate can be an act of power. So in conclusion, the thought that I want to leave all of us with today is that we ought to carefully consider how and when we use the phrase crossing the line regarding faculty activism, and question whose interests we are supporting as we carefully consider both the risks and the power of faculty activism that crosses the line. Thank you very much. I also want to thank especially SRHE and Rob Gresham, who I think I saw is here in this space. Years ago, I was given a newer research award from SRHE, and it has been extremely beneficial in allowing me to pursue this research. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nora. So we're open for questions, and already your paper has stimulated an offline discussion between me and Sandy Acker about what happened in the 60s and 70s, which we can both remember, but most people can't.
There was a lot going on, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And the encampments right across North America, obviously, but also in many other places, including in the UK, posed all sorts of problems, and they were sharpest sometimes not for faculty activists but for institutional leaders. I mean, there were a number of presidents in American universities who couldn't cope with the conflict between what the Senate wanted them to do in the House of Representatives and what their faculty or their students would tolerate back in the institution.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who wants to come in? Let's.
Okay.
No. Well, let me just ask you something else, Nora, because it seems to me that there was a greater degree of tolerance generally for a lot of things that happened 30, 40, 50 years ago than maybe there is now, which may be a funny thing to say because there was some sort of fairly intimidatory crackdowns as well. But nevertheless, those things that happened in the 60s, 70s did indeed bring about quite a lot of change in the direction of the people who were crossing the line, those activists. And I wonder if you had any, I mean, I know you've done quite a lot of research on this. I wonder if you had any sense of whether that is a legitimate interpretation. You know, is there more tolerance now, or is there less tolerance now in terms of those kinds of?
That's a great question. My sense is that there is a kind of cultural shift that's happening right now, that's putting a lot of pressure on higher education and suggesting that higher education, is only for woke people or for folks who are liberal, and imposing those kinds of agendas. And so I think that and the resultant decline in enrollments in higher education, I think, is related as well, obviously, to that cultural shift. And so I think that those conditions add an additional element of fear and of hesitation to appear overly political, or to appear that you have a particular agenda, because I think higher education institutions are trying to say, no, we're not just trying to do that. That's their reaction. And whereas in the 60s and 70s, enrollment in higher education was increasing drastically, it was going up so much, and now it's on the decline. And I think that those kinds of conditions do, in fact, as you're suggesting, really change the kinds of pressures of what's possible to do in a higher education space when we as a society do or do not see the value of higher ed. And I think that the value of higher ed kind of, at least, that's especially true in the United States, but I think it's true elsewhere as well, is really being questioned by a broader public at this point. Yeah.
Well, with the backlash against EDI in particular in the US is marked, isn't it? And Alina has a comment, but I think Alina, if you want to come out and sort of just explain. Sorry, I'm not sure. Probably not.
Yes, just a comment rather than the question. You talked about when there's enough people, and about, I guess, a sort of blockade. That I thought the case in Dublin was very telling, where Trinity College and the encampment there. The encampment blocked off access to the Book of Kells, which is a huge tourist draw and income source for the university. So when that got cut off, the university didn't last very long before it met the protesters' demands and set up sort of various student staff panels to then review links with Israel, but also immediate disinvestment. So yes, that when a university's source of income is affected and enough people are on the ground to see that through, then yes, you know, I think that's the one example I saw where there was a tangible win, if you like, for those protesting.
Yeah, that absolutely. Yeah, I think that idea of interdependent power is especially potent in cases where there are material interests that are being blocked like that. So yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that up.
And I mean, one of the other issues that you often see in student demands, I mean, is because the encampments are mostly about Palestine and Israel, of course, but the climate protesters often sort of one of their demands is disinvestment in all fossil fuel related companies. Now, which takes me back to your original comment about the line is not clearly drawn, you know, and I was struck by a recent comment by one of the Cambridge College heads who said, we have no intention of disinvesting from all fossil fuel related companies because that would more or less force us to disinvest from everything that we invest in at the moment because everyone has some connection with it somewhere. And now, admittedly, that's one of the richest educational institutions in the country, so that was not necessarily a good starting point, and they weren't subject to the same financial pressures that Alina's just put out. But I think when you see that, and you see in the UK, you're seeing some signs of responses from certainly from Oxford and Cambridge heads to well, what you sort of described as perhaps the wilder excesses of wokery, and people just beginning to stand up against those sorts of these institutional leaders, beginning to say, no, we're not going to do that. You know, we're just not going to do that because we don't think it's reasonable, and seeming to survive. Unlike the president of Harvard and one or two others who couldn't survive in that circumstance.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, Sandy wants to come
Yeah.
up.
Okay.
You brought me in a bit, so I have a few thoughts on this. Yes, I'm thinking partly that maybe the line should be thought of as a line. There's lots of maybe types of lines, different thicknesses of lines, maybe even little lines that people kind of cross within their histories. I'm thinking of different examples over time. As I mentioned to Nora in correspondence too, that I was a graduate student in the late 60s when there were a lot of these protests in the United States. I was at University of Chicago, and some students occupied the administration building. And I'm thinking, I don't believe there were any faculty that did that. They would have lost so much at that point in an elite university. There were certainly some faculty that would have counseled the students, would have worked behind the scenes. And one of the things that people were protesting about did concern a faculty member. But there were all kinds of things mixed in, the Vietnam War, other aspects of how students were treated, and the fact that there were protests all over the country and all over the world at the same time. But let's see, I can also think the plenary talk, the kinds of lines that were being discussed were often internal ones. How do we set up women's studies? How do we, change the way the university regards certain fields and certain actions and working with the community and all of that? And I can think of loads of historical moments when that kind of thing was opposed. And in my years at Bristol University, we set up a course called Gender and Social Policy, and it was turned down the first time, and we had to take it again to the Senate. An earlier time when we tried to do a course at night for continuing education, we weren't allowed to put feminist in the title, or maybe we weren't allowed to put women in the title. It ended up being sex and something. I don't know why that was more acceptable, but there were these little fights all the time because it was crossing a line to do anything that was remotely about gender at the time or about feminism. And I remember another instance where I strode into the professor's office and argued with him. This was the head of the department, and said, look, you are giving men all the important jobs in the department, running this program, that program. The women are getting on the library committee, the space committee, and they are not being put on anything that will help them end up getting promoted. And I was angry, but that was crossing a line. That could have come back to hurt me. Maybe it did. So that's why I'm thinking little lines. Now, none of those lines are like encampments and the kinds of major things you're talking about, but they can still harm careers. And I'm wondering, just to bring it up to date, what about places like Texas right now, where the local state law has resulted in, you've probably been reading about this, some of you, titles of education courses being changed from things that say race, class, and gender into critical inquiry. I'm surprised critical is even in there. But all of the DEI related words coming out and people being told their research has to scrub all of the references to race, class, and gender as well. Now, if we protest that, how does that fit in? I mean, guess I'm talking about a lot of things, but is that crossing a line if somebody refuses to do that? You know, it's not only Israel and Palestine or worldwide things. What about people protesting what's going on at that level in their institutions?
Yeah, I absolutely think that you're right. There are so many different kinds of lines, and the particular research that I did was focused on social movements, and so that's why I mentioned those cases. But when I think I said something about the degree to which the lines are policed, I think indicates the amount of power that is held within breaking them. So, the idea that classes in Texas that have any language around diversity, equity, and inclusion are, having to remove those titles, I think that absolutely to resist something like that would be a kind of crossing of the line. It depends, it depends on what line we're talking about. Are we talking about whether the name is allowed to be there? Are we talking about the kind of goal, like I want to change that name, or are we talking about the way in which we protest? I'm gonna, go and try and meet with the Board of Regents, or are we talking about we're gonna set up some kind of other type of protest? And so there's different kinds of lines that have to do with, even just the goals versus the methods. So I agree with you that there are so many different lines. And I guess I believe that in a case like what you're bringing up around Texas, that, I mean, people are already resisting and will continue to. I don't think I think there will be times of kind of flux where there's a huge crackdown right now, and many people will probably lay low because they will lose their jobs if they don't. And they feel like this is the most strategic way for me to actually support diversity and equity is by staying here and laying low and working kind of underground. And other people at some point, if the time is right and there's enough people and they feel like they have some cohesion, they may band together and do something more public to protest that. I think there's a lot of ways that people can be activists. Faculty can be activists in institutions that aren't always publicly seen. You can, and people do work underground and kind of covertly as well. So does that speak to your question?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Rob.
Yeah, it's well, I mean that sorry, who's Rob's just advertising your SRHE funded report, which I'm sure is a great read. Thanks, Rob. Right, well, we need to, I'm afraid, close this down now. I just want to say thank you to Nora for her presentation and starting another lively discussion, as to our earlier presenters. And we've had a good session. Thank you very much, and see you later. Bye.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone.